you think the move towards a more, federalist state structure was a move towards a more strengthened democracy?
One thing I do want to stress, however, is that in comparing with India at this time is it's not so straightforward, because what we're seeing in India is a huge rise in what I would call electoral authoritarianism. It's no longer a level playing field there, both in terms of the media manipulation and capture, also in terms of the resources available to the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. As well as the silencing of dissent. And this is before I've even mentioned the crackdown and everything that's happening to India's Muslim minority.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the New Wave Global. With me today is Professor Katharine Adeney, a professor at the University of Nottingham and someone who's been writing about Pakistan's politics, constitutional issues, democracy in South Asia, and is also associated with the Asia Research Institute at the University of Nottingham. And I would welcome Professor Adeney, and we would talk about the current political impasse in Pakistan. And of course, there have been a lot of discussion around reversing the 18th Amendment in Pakistan. And Professor Adeney also has expertise around the China-Pak Economic Corridor, a program that started back in 2015. And, of course, when it comes to China-Pak Economic Corridor, Pakistanis are very interested in, Pakistan's relations with China. And, of course, there are a lot of discussions, criticism on China, rather about the Chinese imperialism in Pakistan. So there's a big section in Pakistan that thinks, the Chinese interventions, especially in the energy sector in Pakistan, have served Chinese interests more than they've served the Pakistani interests. So we'll be talking about all these issues, of course, in the next 25, 30 minutes, very, very quickly with Professor Adeney. I would just welcome her. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. No, thank you so much for inviting me as well. This is a great honor for me, so thank you.
All right, so there's a lot of issues that I want to discuss with you, but I'd start with the current impasse over elections in Pakistan. How do you see Pakistan's democracy, given your research on democracy in South Asia? Do you think Pakistan's democracy has acted in a manner different to India's, because we see a more stable, sort of secular democracy that strengthened in India over the last 75 years, but the same could not happen in Pakistan?
No, you would be correct in that India has been a democracy for much of its 75-year history, in comparison to Pakistan, which, as we know, has had lots of authoritarian periods and is now in what I would call a hybrid regime. Interestingly, I mean, Pakistan, certainly since 2008, has actually, the electoral procedures have been one of the aspects of Pakistan's democracy that have worked the best in my analysis. Certainly in the 2008 and 2013 elections. The 2018 elections, however, saw more of a reverse and going back to the previous manipulation with what I've analysed, looking at the pre-ballot interventions, but also the post-election rigging and the interventions with the polling officers. One thing I do want to stress, however, is that in comparing with India at this time is it's not so straightforward, because what we're seeing in India is a huge rise in what I would call electoral authoritarianism. It's no longer a level playing field there, both in terms of the media manipulation and capture, also in terms of the resources available to the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, as well as the silencing of dissent. And this is before I've even mentioned the crackdown and everything that's happening to India's Muslim minority. So yes, the suspension of elections in Punjab has been controversial and is very problematic. But at the same time, let's not say that hold up India as the shining example by which Pakistan should be aspiring to.
So are you, Professor, saying that in terms of the in terms of the democratic culture, both, the gap between both countries is now closing up, and with, these dangers to pluralism in India, do you think India is now catching up to what Pakistan was in the past?
I'm not sure catching up would be the right line. I would say that it's downgrading its status.
Yeah.
So we know that the Varieties of Democracy project has downgraded India's status. From I think they call it now an electoral autocracy. Yeah. We know that Freedom House has also downgraded India. I think the challenges are different in India than those faced in Pakistan. So it's not directly comparable. But in terms of the the cracking down on free speech, journalistic freedom, integrity, we can definitely see parallels between the two countries, sadly.
So, Professor, talking about Pakistan's case, of course, Pakistan in our first consensus constitution came out in 1973, and then Pakistan, a lot of constitutional experts believe that it moved Pakistan towards federalism, but Pakistan was a weak federalist state, as per the 1973's constitution. But the 18th Amendment that came about in 2010 basically moved Pakistan towards, at least on paper, a more stronger federation. Do you think federalism and democracy go hand in hand? And federalism, there are a lot of democratic states like the UK itself, which are unitary in terms of their governance structure, but are still democracies. So do you think democracy and federalism go hand in hand? And do you think the move towards a more, federalist state structure was a move towards a more strengthened democracy?
Oh, so many questions in there. I might have to come back and ask you to prompt me on some of them, as I didn't make notes on all of them. First of all, so the 1973 Constitution, absolutely right. Consensus constitution, although that's not to undermine the fact that there were huge disagreements between the regionalist political parties and the PPP over its making. It's also a lot more centralized as a federal system than some analysts of Pakistan have given it, credit for. And interestingly, on some measures, it's even more centralized than the 1962 constitution introduced by Ayub Khan, which was obviously a non-democratic constitution. But nevertheless, there's nothing about a federation that says it has to be particularly decentralized. Federalism is about the sharing of sovereignty. So what's important is what powers the provinces have and whether they're able to exercise them effectively. So in terms of Pakistan and democracy and moving towards something that I was not expecting, having, looked at Pakistan and analysed it for almost 15 years by that point. And then you have the 18th Amendment coming out, which made the series of compromises between the provinces, between the centre and the provinces, a real achievement for Pakistan democracy. And I would actually say that it was more the fact of the democratic political leaders coming together and operating in a way that wasn't going to let the military try and divide them and co-opt them, as we'd seen so strongly in the mid-1990s, and I think we're seeing again today in Pakistan. That enabled the space for, true federal, solutions to be found. We see agreements over reducing the power of the governor. You've got the change of the province name from Northwest Frontier Province to, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Excuse my pronunciation. But it was, these were major changes with the abolition of the concurrent list. So this was a huge moment for Pakistan's, federal system. Although, as you rightly point out, it's some of the implementation has left much to be desired.
Professor Adeney, just on that note.
Sorry, my printer's doing something very, very weird.
Okay.
Right, stop. Okay, sorry, start again.
Yes. So, Professor Adeney, in the recent past, you know how fiscal pressures have been mounting on Pakistan's budget, and the fiscal space in the federal budget has been squeezing up, and the federal government is now made to look towards other options to especially to repay the debt obligations. So what that leaves them with is to start reconsidering the 18th Amendment, and I think the push has also come from the side of the military side, because that puts pressure on the defense budget, and there have been some discussions on sort of containing the defense budget, if I may have to say it that way. So what's your take on that? Do you really think that in states like Pakistan, where decentralization hasn't really, some of the studies that have come out have basically pointed towards not very sizable impacts of decentralization since 2010. So do you think there exists a rationale to keep funding the provinces through the federal budget, and then leaving the federal government not with a lot of fiscal space to meet these external obligations?
I think it's incredibly complicated, and I think to blame the 18th Amendment for Pakistan's debt problems are misguided, to be honest. I mean, Pakistan has gone to the IMF, I can't remember how many times, but
23 times.
It's a sizable number of times. The vast majority of these are before the 18th Amendment was even thought of. Yeah. So this, I think, has a lot more to do with Pakistan's lack of will, lack of political will to set up, a robust taxation system, on which I am far from an expert, so I cannot say the appropriate way to do it. But I'm reliably informed by those who are that this is, it's not a system that collects enough tax. Some of the provinces are in a better position than others to collect taxes, of course, to kind of also fund their programs. So obviously Karachi, parts of Punjab, but I mean other parts don't have the ability, even with that money coming from the federal government, to even fund their provinces properly. So if you look at the development outcomes in Balochistan, for example, incredibly low, and that's got a lot to do with the lack of resources that province has, even post the 18th Amendment, because the provisions there about the allocation of resources and the finances from the natural resources have not been implemented. So Balochistan's not actually seeing the money from those natural resources coming into its coffers.
Okay, yeah. So, Professor, my question is that one of the areas that the federal government then starts to look towards is, a lot of circular debt is mounting in the energy sector, and that's because the government owes a lot of payments to the Chinese IPPs. And that then brings into question the China-Pak economic corridor, because when you start discussing the fiscal space of the federal government, three things come to mind. And these things are discussed with the IMF right now as well. One, of course, is the defense budget. And then are, these sovereign obligations towards the Chinese, which were made under the China-Pak economic corridor. And the third thing, as we've already discussed, is the payments that we make to the provinces under the NFC award. So do you think that as far as the China-Pak economic corridor is concerned, do you see any substance in the allegations that a certain segment of the Pakistani society makes of the Chinese imperialist designs in Pakistan? And do you think these contracts with the IPPs were rightly negotiated by the Pakistan government? Sorry, I'm asking too many questions, but...
No, I mean, it's lovely to have an opportunity to discuss these issues. So I think that, I mean, it's undeniable that the IPP contracts that were set up under the PMLN government, with the Chinese were very, very favourable to the Chinese companies involved. And China and the Chinese companies have been understandably reluctant to renegotiate the terms of these. So I think that has been very problematic, and it was obviously tied to the need to get the energy production sorted. This was a huge thing in Nawaz Sharif's 2013 election campaign. So this was a priority of the first phase of CPEC. I don't see China's goal as an imperialist power in Pakistan. I don't see that as something that's happening, but I do have concerns about the amount of debt that Pakistan is building up to China, in the sense that at the beginning of the CPEC, everyone who was, and at that point you couldn't say anything negative about CPEC, but at the beginning when this was first introduced, everyone was saying, well, yes, we're taking all these loans from China, but our GDP is going to rise, and if it rises by these many percentage points, then servicing the debt is not going to be a problem. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And there's no signs, again, unfortunately, that the GDP is going to rise sufficiently to enable it to service that debt. And then that has consequences because, of course, the IMF does not wish to loan money to Pakistan, which then goes directly to China. Having said that, I'm not a naysayer on CPEC in the sense that I think it's an altogether, bad idea. I think a lot of the projects that are being introduced in Pakistan, especially the ones to do with renewable energy, you've got road building, there's talk of some agricultural projects, which if they work for Pakistan's favour, and that is an if, depending on water security in the crops that are grown. And I don't think we know enough about that yet. But I do think that there is, potential for this to work, or elements of it to work for Pakistan. But the debt is a real concern.
Professor, are other projects that were originally part of the BRI, apart from CPEC, of course, are they functional, or other countries that went into, became part of the Chinese BRI facing a similar fate as Pakistan is facing right now?
The obvious one is Sri Lanka.
Yes.
With the, and again, it was a glory project. It was connected to a particular politician, Mahindra Rajapaksa, with the building of Hambantota Port, which has not lived up to expectations, has saddled Sri Lanka with enormous levels of debt, and eventually led to a long-term lease to China. We're not seeing that in Pakistan yet. But we will. I mean, we wait and see. Pakistan is a bigger, a stronger country. It has a much longer history of working with China, which hopefully will work in its favour. But yeah, this has had parallels before, and other countries in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, have rolled back on some of the BRI investments that were going to happen because they were afraid of how this would all pan out.
Right. So Professor, on the CPEC note, do you think that CPEC has a future in Pakistan? Because, in my understanding, a lot of these projects are already, past their past the half project life cycle. So they're past the midterm of their project life cycle. So do you really think that finishing some of these projects would sort of prove to be the game changer that CPEC was originally thought of as being? Or do you think that Pakistan would just have to contend with these IPP problems and debt issues vis-a-vis CPEC? Should we expect something from CPEC?
I think that you're going to, I mean, a lot of the projects have been completed. I mean, 100% have been completed in Sindh and Punjab, much less in Balochistan, it must be said. And the majority of them have now been completed in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Again, you can see the political reasoning here as well as to why some of these have been completed while others have not. I think it depends which direction it goes in. There's a lot of talk of industrial development, special economic zones. I'm seeing very little potential in that area, despite the, the talk about, all these investors coming in. They've been beset by problems with, even getting utilities provided to these, special economic zones. And the federal government has again and again kind of had to step in, although I'm not quite sure then what's actually happening on the ground. But I think, as I said, there are other areas, maybe with renewable energy, which we know that China is becoming a big fan of now and is investing in a lot of technology there. We're also seeing a lot of focus on agriculture. And I haven't done any research on this yet, but I did find it interesting that there was talk about the week ago about the army acquisition of a lot of agricultural land. So I leave that hanging. But who knows? But I do think that agriculture is going to be probably, after the special economic zones, the next big thing in CPEC. And it may even be more successful than the special economic zones, seeing that they haven't actually done that much to date.
I hope I'm able to publish this program. You're touching a dangerous nerve there. So, my last question, Professor Adeney, thank you very much for very detailed and elaborate answers. And I'm sure my audience has learned a lot from you by now. But on democracy in Pakistan, we've entered a new wave of political instability since April 2022. And I'm sure you're looking at, the political developments as they happen in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Do you think that, this political instability, would be, are we seeing a climax as yet? Or do you think this would continue in the next couple of years, maybe, as some of the pundits here are projecting?
That's a very dangerous question. Asking to predict a weekend. Pakistani politics and British politics, are the same, right? At the moment, they're just both crazy. You cannot predict what's going to happen. I think it's very likely to continue. And whether or not you have elections, I don't see this putting many of the issues that Khan has raised to bed. Whether or not, I talked about the pre and post-election rigging in 2018, but that's not to say that the PTI was not an incredibly popular political party with a huge base of support within the country, who are, on social media. They're very active, and we've seen them on the streets as well. So, and he knows that. He knows he can mobilize a huge crowd, and that's something that he's not going to take lying down. And who knows what's going to happen in the next election? You can posit a number of different scenarios, but I still think that we're going to see a lot of tensions between the different political parties, but many of the other important actors in the room as well.
All right. Thank you, Professor Adeney, for joining us and for enlightening us today about democracy in South Asia and, what Pakistan should expect going into the future. Definitely, I would like to have a follow-up session with you in the future. And of course, my audience would also like to listen more from you. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.